Today, we had the pleasure of meeting Jill Heinrich, a content creator focused on exposing MLM organizations and toxic religious groups and host of the Opportunity Cost podcast. Her mission is to educate people on the dangers of high control groups and how to spot the red flags they often present.
In this conversation, Jill breaks down what multi-level marketing is, how they are illegal, and why she feels called to investigate them. We also discuss how they use cult tactics to control their members and how the MLM system as a whole is designed for most people to fail. In addition, Jill shares openly about her own experience leaving Christianity, how it's reshaped her relationship with spirituality, and offers advice for leaving toxic organizations. This was a super interesting episode, and we hope you enjoy. All right. Well, today we are talking to Jill. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
So, for anyone listening who isn't familiar with your work, how do you describe what you do?
So I wanted to start a podcast about a year ago or so, but most people kind of find me through social media. But I talk a lot about scams, about MLMs. MLMs pretty heavily feature on all of my content. And I really just try to dive into the history, dive into the financials, dive into some of the manipulation tactics that happen when you're encountering everyday scams. And when you're being recruited for MLMs and other things.
Yeah, your videos pop up on my TikTok all the time. And I was like, oh, we got to talk to her because I'm always so intrigued. I was really curious to find out how you got interested in this work. Because I feel maybe you were just interested, but I was also curious if you had a personal experience or you observed something.
Yeah, it's kind of twofold. So the first reason I got really involved is because I had a best friend who got recruited into an MLM, and I had a conversation with her about them because I knew that they're not a good idea to get involved with. But I had a conversation with her about them, and I said, "Hey, this is be careful. They can be really financially damaging. Just keep track of what's going on." And it was like she was a different person. I didn't recognize her anymore. She was just listing off the company line of all the objection handling and reasons why she wanted to get involved. And I was like, okay, you do you. And I lost contact with her because she had gotten so involved in the MLM. And I honestly today, I don't even know if she's still in it or not, if she's still involved or if she got out. We just don't have a relationship anymore, which I think is a pretty common experience for people who have a friend or a family member that gets involved in MLM. It becomes kind of their whole identity. And then the second reason is that MLMs and scams really hit all of kind of interest points that I'm interested in, which is wealth, culture, gender, religion in some cases, white collar crime, financial malfeasance and fraud, and MLMs and scams. And even in some cases, I cover some things about religious and spiritual manipulation. They all kind of have that intersectionality that fascinates me, and I can't get enough of it. And so I try to talk about the nuances of all of that. Social media only shows you a certain amount of things that are going on there. But yeah, I just find it super fascinating. And I think it's stuff that people need to be aware of.
Yeah, I feel like most people kind of have an idea of MLMs or some of the more well-known scams, but I'm sure you're kind of shedding light on things that people maybe didn't know the extent of it. Are there any scams that you've researched that people had no idea about? Maybe it was a big brand that people thought was fairly normal, that you're kind of educating people about.
Yeah, I think there's some things that I'm looking into with my new season that's going to come out, I don't know when, second season, that are really common, shamans that people will kind of go to, or coaches, life coaches, any kind of supplement companies. There are a lot of supplement companies out there that are making claims about what they can do, how they can heal something in you, either spiritually or medically, or whatever their claims are. There are a lot of things that could be perceived as scams that on the surface might not look like it. In some cases, that could be religion, depending on what your experiences is with that group. I think sororities could be
Mm.
classified as scams, but they're kind of, it's a little bit subjective. Your experience with that thing is going to determine how you view it in retrospect. And so not everybody is going to have the same experience with a scam or with a group like that or with a company at all. So I don't know. I think lots of things could be perceived as scams, but aren't necessarily to everybody.
Yeah, when you said it's subjective, I was like, I could see that because for some person it may really serve. I mean, unless they're financially being, manipulated and taken advantage of and all of that. But for some people, I've heard many people who love being in a sorority and then some people who are like, you couldn't pay me, you have to pay them.
Like I
Oh,
have to pay.
yeah,
Yeah.
I would never do it. Or, same thing when you said coaching, I'm like, oh yeah. So often with these conversations, it can be manipulated into like people being like, oh, well, I have the answers. And so rather it's like giving the power back to the listener or to the people who are interested in these conversations and be like, no, you can do it when it comes to spiritual topics. And so I feel like with coaching or with any kind of healing shamanic work where you give the power to someone else, there's a lot of room for manipulation and scamming that I don't even know if the person facilitating fully understands that they're doing that.
Yeah, I think that's 100% true. I've been looking into different coaching groups and teachers, and it's kind of one of those things where that similar dynamic could happen with a therapist, where you're in a power imbalance with somebody regardless. Like you're giving your money, you're giving your time, and your kind of like internal spiritual work or whatever life coaching. There's a lot of details that get divulged, and so obviously there's a power imbalance that happens there, so anything could be manipulated. And like you said, I think it's totally true that some people, their approach feels manipulative or can feel manipulative to the recipient of that in one scenario. And in another scenario, it's a really good match. And that service is being exchanged and it's 100% what that person thought that they were paying for and got value out of that. So it's a really tricky dynamic, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. When you're looking at a person, an organization, a company that you want to research and kind of expose in a sense, what are some red flags that you look for as far as if it's considered, I guess, a scam?
Yeah, I think most of the time the biggest red flags are any kind of promises made, any kind of, what I see a lot is like, you can make $10,000 in 2 weeks, or I retired my husband with this opportunity, or I get to go on vacation and I don't work a 9 to 5. Some kind of claim that's either monetary or I've seen medical claims a lot with MLMs too of their products saying like, oh, this hydrogen Kangen water is going to
Mm.
like heal you and transform your body from the inside out. And like, you can't make those claims. Like you have there's no scientific backing for a lot of the claims that are being made. And so, but everyone can post anything or say anything on the internet with pretty much impunity. So that's what I see the most is kind of like these claims that seem outlandish and exaggerated. And like that's sketchy to me. And I think I'm a skeptic at heart. I'm a very skeptical person. I try not to be. I try to kind of like approach things with like an open mind and an open heart. But there are certain red flags that I'm just like, no, something's not right about you.
Yeah. Well, I think you're needed because there is so many people who are so like I'm a very gullible person, honestly. My whole life. I'm like, well, look at that.
$10,000
I'm
in a
like,
month. I'm sold.
and so I mean, again, this is why I wanted to talk to you because I think having a healthy level of skepticism is important. Um, but yeah, when you said Kangen water, I'm like, oh my gosh, I've seen all those videos. I found you specifically because you were talking about what are they called? The olive tree people. And it kind of sounds similar. I didn't look into them necessarily. I just watched your video on it. I was like, oh, like it gives spirituality such a bad rap. Honestly, I say this time and time again. I don't even love the term spirituality anymore. It's just like living an authentic life as a good person, honestly. Like that's what we talk about most of the time. And so when I see things like this, I'm like, gosh, like you're just giving it's giving it a bad rap, all over the place.
Yeah,
For
I think Yeah, I think with olive tree people and with any kind of, there are a lot of MLMs or scams, people that talk about spiritual topics or try to kind of graft that onto the sales of something. And I'm really interested in kind of this, it's generally a new thing, I think, with the birth of the internet and birth of social media, that like spirituality, new age thinking, new age concepts are getting combined with this like capitalistic, wealth centered thing. And so when those two get combined, it can get a little bit sketchy, a little bit convoluted. When I looked at olive tree people, it was really interesting to me because they had that spiritual bent. They talk about kind of the healing frequencies that they have from the olive tree groves that they sell, but they're not doing that necessarily altruistically. They're selling something to you and using a model that's statistically designed for people to fail in. And so all those companies I found super interesting. I didn't really expect olive tree people to get as popular as it is. That kind of happened because there was another MLM that was failing or is failing. And so a bunch of people will typically jump ship from one company to another and try to kind of be the first ones in the door so that they get stacked at the top of the pyramid. That's a really common thing that happens. And so olive tree people just happens to have that right product set, they have the right marketing, they have the right kind of appeal to more spiritual people. And I see a lot of Christian girls also in olive tree people. That is a big population in their group. And there's that spiritual manipulation and the Christianity kind of side of things of olive tree people too.
anyone who isn't familiar, can you kind of get debrief us on the olive tree people?
Yeah. So Olive Tree People is a multi-level marketing company, and multi-level marketing companies are essentially legal pyramid schemes. They are technically legal, but the SEC and the FTC shut them down a lot because they're operating as pyramid schemes. But they operate legally here in the US and in Canada and a couple different countries. But Olive Tree People sells skincare, they sell these frequency healing devices. They sell some like internal elixirs that you can ingest, and they have olive leaf extract in them. So they're selling, supplements, they're selling makeup, they're selling skincare that has their kind of like the focus is around olive oil and on olive extract kind of products.
Mm.
That's interesting. You were mentioning how there's kind of this dynamic of people jumping from one MLM to another when one fails. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like, it sounds like they do, to a certain extent, understand what they're getting involved with because they're like, oh, if I get in first, I'm at the top. So, do you think there is a level of people understanding what they are a part of, but being like, but if I'm in first, then I'm in a good position, you know?
Yeah, I think it depends on the person. So with this kind of jumping from one to another, that's usually precipitated by the leadership. So the top 1% of the company, they've been in MLMs for a long time. Most of them didn't even start in the previous company. They've been in MLM for 10, 20 years. And they understand how it works. I believe that they understand that they are in a pyramid scheme, that they are taking advantage of people, and that they know that their team, 99% of them will lose money. But for the people that are underneath them that might get drawn into the new company because they're following their leader, they have loyalty to that top leader that they've been brought in by, who's, kind of inculcated themselves to them, and they trust them. And so they're getting pulled over. They might not necessarily understand that this is about getting in early. They think that's just because it's a better comp plan, it's a better, product set, it's a better way for them to leave to a better system. So I don't think that they're necessarily aware, but I do think the top leaders are aware that their downlines are losing money, that they're not being successful, that they're not getting paid a living wage. So it's a nuanced thing. I have sympathy for the people that are at the bottom who don't understand what they've gotten themselves into, but I don't have sympathy for any of the executive leadership or with the top leadership in MLMs because I think they know what they're doing.
Yeah. Can you explain for anyone who doesn't like thoroughly understand what an MLM is or a pyramid scheme? Can you explain kind of the basic foundation of that?
Yeah. So MLMs are so you can get paid if you join an MLM, you can get paid in two ways. You typically buy a starter kit, which is like $200, $300, depending on the packs that they have. And you can make money in two ways, either through sales of the product to friends and family. You make a certain percentage of sales off of those, or you can get paid by bringing in people underneath you and they become part of your downline, and you can make bonuses based off of how many people you have underneath you. Their sales and their volume, their personal purchases go towards your bonuses. So you make a percentage off of those. But in MLMs, you make more money off of recruiting than you do for straight up product sales. And so there's a lot of incentive for people to recruit. There's more incentive for people to kind of try to pull people in and manipulate people into joining the business than there is about, hey, this is a great product. You should use it. I love it. I have an affiliate or like I have a percentage that I make off of these sales. And so what we see is that 99% statistically lose money because they spend money on monthly product purchases for themselves. You are required most of the time to purchase a certain volume every month. And they're also spending money going to events that the company puts on. There's a lot of extra trips and things that are additional expenses that the people that are getting in don't necessarily know upfront that they're going to be asked to do.
Yeah, it's so uncomfy when you get invited. It's happened to me countless times. I'm sure it's happened to like every, especially
Yeah.
female, countless times. Where yeah, you get a random DM like or like message on Facebook and someone's like, "Oh my gosh, I love your outfit in this picture." And then you're like, "Oh my gosh, hi, I haven't talked to you in a while. Thanks." And she's like, "Do you want to check out da 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 da?" And you're like, "Oh man, it happened. She
Like
got me."
they suck you in slowly.
Yeah, or just like
Yeah.
an actual friend who's like, "Hey, you wanna come over and, like, shop this?" I mean, for in the case I'm thinking of, like, skincare, and you're like, "Oh, okay," and then you come over and you sit there and you gotta do the whole
Hmm.
thing, and you end up buying something because you feel bad, but she wants you to sign up for something, and you're just like it's so uncomfy, and I don't know how they don't sense that they're making other people uncomfortable.
So I think one of the things that fascinates me the most about MLMs and why I talk about them the most is really there's a lot of cult tactics that they use to manipulate people. So I've sat on certain MLM calls that I sneak my way into some Zoom calls,
Oh my gosh,
and
I love that.
they're specifically trained to capitalize on weaknesses. They're specifically trained to capitalize on single moms, on moms who have just had babies and are postpartum and they aren't going to work or can't go back to work. They capitalize on lots of different things, and they're specifically trained to target those people and message them in ways that capitalizes on their hopes, their dreams, their fears. And that's why it affects women the most, because when we talk about MLMs, we're really talking about gaps in the social safety net for women. Single women have a really, really difficult time. Obviously, women who have military husbands, they can't really work traditional jobs. Women who are having children can't go back to work, or, there's a lot of things that are happening in our social system that MLMs take advantage of.
Mm.
Yeah, this is trippy because so I was a part of doTERRA for a couple of years, which is an MLM. And so just talking through this, I'm getting all these like flashbacks of conversations that I would have because I got to a point where I was just not really enjoying what I was doing. I was kind of uncomfortable. I didn't like going to friends and family and like trying to sell them on stuff. And I would think about like all the things that they would like come back to me with. Like they had an answer for everything, they had a solution,
Mhm.
quote unquote, for everything that you're going through. So it's like, there's everyone's so well indoctrinated of like, okay, if this happens, you say this. If this happens, you say this. And like they're always ready.
Yeah, it's they've really established like a sophisticated objection handling system. And I work in sales. I worked in sales for a really long time. So I recognize, when they're doing these tactics, I'm like, this is a sales tactic. This is a manipulation tactic. And they've really gotten good at it. And it's horrible to watch because you're just like, these are people that are just looking for a way out. They're just looking to pay for their groceries for a week with this thing. And the reality is that that's not statistically, that's not going to happen. What's going to happen is that it's going to run their credit cards dry, and they're going to be in a worse off position after they join than they were before they even started. So that's why I do what I do. I cannot stand these companies. I think they're super predatory. And I talk about that on my podcast. So if anybody's interested in like the history, they have a lot of lobbying power in Congress. They have a lot of historical lobbying that's happened at the Senate level, the House level, the presidential level that's happened over decades. And so that's what keeps them from getting shut down by the FTC. They have a lot of sway that people don't necessarily know about.
Yeah. What are generally the longevity of these companies? Because I feel like a lot of times with these, more known brands, I'm thinking of like doTERRA specifically right now. I feel like it hit this like stride. Like there were years where you saw it everywhere. Everyone was talking about it. Everyone was using it. And I think about it now, I'm like, I can't remember the last time I heard someone even say that word. So is it generally like they kind of capitalize on certain moments in time where it's really hitting the general population, and then it's like almost an inevitable decline at a certain point, or are there some companies that are able to kind of keep going for a long period of time?
Yeah, I think the answer to that is twofold. There are some companies that just legacy companies that have been around for decades. Mary Kay is still around. Herbalife is still around. These companies have been around for like 30, 40, 50 years. So they always have a certain threshold of reps that they're able to maintain. And typically with MLMs, what we see in the market, and I'm planning on doing something about this too, is typically in the market when we see a dip in the economy, you see a recession during COVID-19 pandemic when everybody lost their jobs, you typically see kind of an inverse reaction with MLMs getting successful. We're in a recession right now. We're seeing MLMs kind of on the uptick. And that's normal, I think. That happened in the 80s, it happened in 2008, it happened in 2020, and it's happening now. So usually it's when people are desperate that they have the best chance at recruiting a lot of people. I do think that the anti-MLM movement, people that are talking about them, is reaching kind of an inflection point in the media. There are documentaries being made, and that's something that hasn't happened in the past. So I do think there is a general decline happening in MLM industry right now, which is, I think is great. But it's always that like when one company gets shut down, another one will rise in its place because the executive team will be like, okay, well, that didn't work. We're going to start a different one,
Mm.
So I think it ebbs and flows. But there is like doTERRA is really popular for a while. Right now, it's All of Tree People is really popular right now. And I think that just changes with the whoever can kind of capitalize on the market trends that are happening. Like there are companies talking about supplements that they're designed to be like Ozempic or be like these weight loss drugs. There are a lot of companies that are trying to capitalize on things that are getting popularized in culture in the market, and they can have some success there with that too.
Yeah, I see how the doTERRA and the pathway to olive tree people is definitely there because they kind of give the same vibe, you know?
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, as you're talking, I'm just thinking about more and more like the LuLaRoe documentary on Amazon Prime. I'm pretty sure that's where it was. That is fascinating and horrific and so sad. Um, and just crazy. I feel like that. Do you have any other documentaries that you recommend? Because I feel like that is a great one that really kind of breaks down what's going on.
Yeah, there's one, it's kind of old. It's called Betting on Zero. It's about Herbalife.
Mm.
And that one specifically is interesting because they talk about how they really recruit in the Latino community, and kind of specifically target those communities. And that's why they have a sponsorship with a football team, that Cristiano Ronaldo has had like that on his jersey for years. I'm trying to think of any other ones that I've seen. There's a fictional one called On Becoming God in Central Florida that has Kirsten Dunst in it. And I think she's like a an MLM leader or something in a fictional MLM. I've heard that one was really good, but I haven't seen it myself.
Mm. Yeah. Have you seen that? I'm sure you're well versed in all of them, but the on TikTok right now or a couple years ago, I don't know. They would come up on my TikTok live all the time, and it's the people selling like fizzy jewelry, like the bomb. Yeah.
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
Yes.
And I would just sit there, Danielle, and be like, "What are you doing?" Because we live together. And I would just be sitting there watching it because it's fascinating because you can see it in real time watching them sell. And then people like messaging in, being like, "I want to do it." And like and then the girls who, or the women who can get like, that have like a lot of following and like a lot of clout, and just their ego and the energy behind it. And they're like, "Well, you can be like, yeah, I don't know what it's called, but basically like below me, and like I'll show you the way." And I'm like, "Oh my gosh."
What are they fizzy jewelry? What are they
They're
selling?
like bath bombs that they like drop into water on
Oh.
camera, and you don't know what you're getting. You just
Mm.
like, I think it's mainly like rings, but you can choose if you want like earrings, rings, whatever kind of jewelry. And then I make and sell jewelry, by the way, so this is also why I find it fascinating. And so, and then these women will be like, "I'll take one," and it's like size 6, and then they drop it in, and you don't know what you're getting until she holds it up to the camera and she's like,
Yeah.
"Ta-da, look it." So it's like there's this interactive element to it that's like made for the internet now, which is interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did an episode about Bomb Party, actually, it's
Okay.
called Bomb Party
Bomb
Jewelry. I
party.
think there's a couple different I think there's Bomb Party and then there's Rise. If
Okay.
anybody is on Reddit, there is a, like, Bomb Party Reddit thread, which is hilarious, and they follow, like, these certain top, um
Like
the
reps.
people that are
Yeah.
really popular, and they'll like hop onto their live streams and like hang out. It's hilarious. It's so funny. But if you're ever bored, that's a great place to go. But yeah, they're an MLM. If you look in the background of some of those ladies' TikToks, you can see all the inventory, like hundreds of rings, hundreds of necklaces and trinkets and things that they're spending. Like I think I calculated one person's inventory just from the screenshot of her TikTok, and she had spent like $20,000 on inventory.
Have you joined our Patreon subscription yet?
Our Patreon offers 2 solo bonus episodes a month where you get an inside look at what's going on behind the scenes and in our lives, immediate access to our exclusive community where you can talk to us personally, as well as a library of episodes that are ready to binge.
This is a place for our listeners to support us directly so we can continue to make the content that you love.
Once you subscribe, send us a message so we can start chatting.
The link to join is in our description. See you on Patreon. That's wild.
And what's
It's a
the
lot.
incentive to do that? I mean, like, so if you spend more as the rep, do you get like ranked higher? No?
No,
It's just you have more to
no.
sell. And so, and then if you
Yeah.
sell, it's kind of like, well, that's on you to sell it. That's like your whole thing. Like if you can't do it.
So the way that the leadership talks about that, talks about inventory, and this isn't exclusive to Bomb Party, it's kind of like every MLM. They're like, well, you need to have everything available in like multiples so that you, if people are interested and if that becomes like a hot product, that you have it on hand and that they're not going to go to another rep to find that thing
Mm.
because you already have it. And so they kind of are like, well, you need X amount of rings in each size. You need each of these birthday collections, and MLMs are constantly releasing new product lines. They're like, oh, we have this new product line and this new product line, usually once a month or even once a quarter, sometimes more. They'll have sales on certain things. And so the company is always pushing you to buy more inventory, but it doesn't actually help you unless you have a ghost account. So what a ghost account is that you kind of have your account is technically not allowed, but the MLM usually turns a blind eye to it. You can set up basically an account under your dog or your husband or your friend or whatever, and you purchase inventory underneath that line. And so that CV, that volume gets counted under you then.
Mm. You get kind of your like cut from it or your commission essentially because it's coming from someone else, but it's
Yeah.
actually, okay, got it.
But it's
Interesting.
actually you buying it. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And I feel like it would be, I mean, you're isolating yourself from your own community as far as like whether you're conscious of it or not, making people around you uncomfortable. Like you said with your friend, like you're probably burning some bridges at some point, but it's all for the sake of your business. But at the same time, it's like the people, I'm like, if Danielle and I were both doing an MLM together and friends, there'd be like a level of competition between us too, where it's like, now I'm messing up my friendships with people who are like within the company, or even if like, because I've seen people post when they like go on the trips and stuff, and it's like, we're the top reps or whatever. It's just, it's fascinating to me. Um, and it's so interesting too, because I'm like the psychology behind it, where it's like, how I don't get how they don't know. You know what I mean? Or do they know and they don't care? I have like the imagery of like they're everyone's on a sinking ship and you just have like buckets that you're trying to freaking get the water out of the ship so you can keep it afloat as long as possible. But eventually it's going to go down and you're going to go down with it, you know?
Yeah, I think what happens when you join an MLM is like the second you join an MLM, you get put into like a bunch of groups, a bunch of Facebook groups or whatever, and you get love bombed by everyone who's in the company. They're like, oh my God, Danielle just joined. I'm so excited. She's awesome. And like everybody love bombs you coming in. And then you start getting into the Zoom calls that you're on team calls multiple times a week, and that community, that MLM community of people becomes your community. And so they kind of are really good about removing you from your community and depositing you in this like super positive environment where you're being supported and everybody's like, yeah, like you're a business owner, and kind of start feeding you all of these manipulation tactics that I think most people are not even aware it's happening. They're just like, oh my God, like these people really like me. They're really invested in me. They really want me to be successful. And when your family or friends come to you and say, hey, like, I don't know about this, like, it's a little bit sketchy, I don't know, then you're primed for that group of people to say, oh, they just don't believe in you. They just don't want you to be successful. They are not invested in you and don't think that you can do this. And we disagree. Like, we think that you are amazing and blah, blah, blah. So you're kind of primed to separate yourself then from your typical support system.
And that's another cult tactic because that's exactly what happens when you join a cult. It's like, oh, well, this is your new family. Like, you don't need them
Mm-hmm.
anymore. So it's kind of creepy when you compare the two.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are a lot of
Manipulation.
similarities.
Yeah. Manipulation in general. Cause it's like, I could also, you know, I think about people who leave like a religion and it's a very similar situation where it's like, well, that, don't listen to that person kind of thing. Um yeah, do you have any stories, I guess, about like or any cults that you not love, but like that you find really interesting? Cuz we love talking about cults as well.
Cults. I know there's so many.
I know.
I mean, if we want to get into it, like I recently deconstructed from Christianity, which I had been in my whole life. And that in some cases, I think I mentioned this earlier, like in some spaces, it can be culty. Um, I don't know if you want to get into that or not.
Yeah. Yeah, let's get into it.
Yeah.
If that's something you feel comfortable with, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd say like, so I've always been a very spiritual person and I still am. Like I still believe in some sort of source, some sort of energy, a creator. I don't know what that is. But I had been raised in the church for a very long time and in the Southern Baptist church. And so there would always be these times where I'd be pushing up against certain cultural things, which I think sometimes, I think in any religion, we have a hard time separating kind of a philosophical belief system with the cultural implications of the application of that belief system. And so many times it'd be butting up against kind of that cult mentality of thing of being like, well, if you don't kind of behave the way that we want you to behave, then you can't sit with us. Then you like aren't really a real Christian. Or are you listening to God? Or, like, and that's not everybody's experience. But I think sometimes it can be a common experience of being like, okay, well, I don't fit into this like mold that they've set out for what they think real Christians are supposed to be. And so when that happens, you kind of feel like an outsider. I want to be careful and say, like, just because you're like, I don't view Christians in any sort of negative light. I think they believe what they believe, and that's fine. Like, I want people to believe whatever they want. But I think where it gets dangerous and can be dangerous is when you're kind of forcing people into a certain behavior set without necessarily their consent, you know?
Mhm.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I think judgment for me, just speaking in my own experience of being in Christianity and kind of moving away from it, I feel like there is this immense amount of judgment. If you don't fit into this certain box, if you don't have these beliefs, it's like there's this separation that is created, even though it's like we should all feel free to kind of live our own ways and even if we do kind of have a similar set of beliefs. So I think that's something that comes into play as well.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because it's like all three of us, because especially if you were a white female living in America, I'm sure at some point you have dabbled in a religion somewhere, um, or not. Some people have not. But I know for the fact that all three of us are having this conversation in Christianity has been a part of our lives. It's like no coincidence. But I think that shows that there's a level of like being open to it. Like obviously there's a lot of good intent. Like that's why I was drawn to it, is because like there were times that it made me feel seen and made me feel really good. And I now, at whatever point I'm at with my relationship with that religion in specific and, Jesus and all of that, like I feel really good with where I'm at and understanding that. But back in the day, like when I was in youth group, I'll never forget the moment we were in, there was like 60 kids sitting there and we were talking about outer space and they were just basically telling us like you just have to trust that you'll never know. Like, and I raised my hand and I was like, what about science? And afterwards they came up to me, like I don't even really remember what I said. I was like 17 years old, and they said if you have a question, you need to ask us privately. You are not to raise your hand in front of the group anymore. And I just was like, that doesn't sit right with me. There's like, I don't understand why I can't, And then eventually, I went off and lived my life and separated in my own way. But just that moment will always stick with me because I'm like, I feel like the second you start to question, they see you, they pull you away, and you are now like, there's kind of like a red flag on you where people are like, watch out for her.
Yeah, I feel like sometimes there's this line that Christians draw that are like, okay, well, here are things that you can question and say that you don't know about. And here are some things that are just not negotiable. They are truth, which I don't believe that like objective truth exists exactly. And I think Christians are very, not all obviously, but like are very hard pressed to say that they don't know, certain things about their dogma or their belief system are like, well, this is truth. And there's no, but it's faith. Of course, there's an element that you're like, I don't know. Like, I
Mhm.
never met Jesus. I never heard the voice of God. Like, like there's so many things that are like, well, you can't claim some sort of truth about this and try to kind of manipulate me or form me around that thing when like there's no claim to that. So I think that's one of those things. I have so many stories like that of especially like purity culture. I grew up in the 90s and early 2000s in Texas, and purity culture was such a huge concept that was just beaten into our heads for years about like, this is how you act, this is how you dress, this is how you speak, this is when you should get married, who should get married to. I went to school in California and I had several people tell me, don't you know that there are a bunch of liberals out there? And I was like, why do you think that I'm going? It was just this thing where I was just like, I don't belong here. And I tried for years to kind of be the change or, fit myself into that kind of mold for them and be like, I'm gonna do Christianity, but I'm gonna do it differently. And now I'm kind of like, okay, like I need a time period where I just opt out, and it
Mhm.
doesn't mean that I won't return to some semblance of that thing again or find a community that works for me. But I'm just like, I think what's hard about Christianity, and especially for those that are in kind of like fundamentalist communities, like the Baptist Church, like certain denominations are much more fundamentalist than others, is that once you leave or once you decide, hey, I'm going to opt out, that the experience of a lot of people is that they get cut off from their friends and family. They get cut off from their community. They're told, oh, well, it's kind of like Scientology, like they're a suppressive person. Like they're like, well, they're not walking in the Lord. And so they're not necessarily a good person to be around right now. And that's the point that I'm like, that's sketchy and that's a little bit culty for me.
Yeah, for sure. Do you feel like when you separated from that community, it affected your relationship with your own spirituality? Because I feel like a lot of times when we have bad experiences with religion, we kind of just want to say, oh, all spirituality is bad, or just completely separate ourselves from it entirely. Do you feel like that happened, or were you able to kind of find your own beliefs within yourself after that experience?
That's a great question. I think I had an intense spiritual experience after I left. And the reason I say that is because it was just this like weight lifted that I was like, I can remove the dogma from my shoulders and define spirituality because I still feel like a spiritual person. And the way I've heard it described, and I think it makes a lot of sense for me, and it just feels more peaceful, more grounding, is, you're kind of born into a room. And there are a lot of things in the room. There's an ugly couch that you might not like, and some paintings, and a rug, and a couple of knickknacks here. And deconstruction is really just taking things out of the room until you're left with a blank, empty room. And you get to decide then, what am I going to bring back into the room? Am I going to bring back in something that wasn't here originally that I found somewhere else? Or maybe I did like that couch that was in here. I'm going to come back and bring it in because it still feels like me. And that's really what I feel like my spiritual experience has been like outside of the church. It's like this lifting off of all of these like burdens and convolution and all of these kind of dogmatic things that I didn't actually really need and I didn't actually really like. And so now I get to decide.
Yeah. Are there any parts that you feel comfortable sharing? Things that you put back into your room?
I think of, I don't know, divinity a little bit differently. Like if there is a creator God, whatever that God looks like, whether it was somebody that put evolution into existence and everything is moving now in a forward course, and he or she doesn't necessarily have impact on that course. We're all just humans living in a space, right? I think that if I think about a creation force existing, then it kind of leads me to see people differently. I can see them as, a divine being walking around the world, interacting with me, that isn't a part of a separate group. They're not defined by their religion, just like I'm not defined by my religion or any kind of dividing line that we place in our kind of evolutionary understanding. Like, here's my in-group people and here's my out-group people. Like, I don't necessarily see things that way anymore. And I think, yeah, I think I'm still figuring it out. And I think what's really nice is just saying that I don't know. I
Mhm.
don't I don't know a lot of things. And I really enjoy not knowing a lot of
Yeah.
things.
Yeah. I feel like it's a red flag immediately for me when someone tells me or tells someone else like, "Oh, I have the way. I know the way." And
Mhm.
it's like, you can know what's good for you. You can know what's worked well for you, but, you know, trying to force that on someone else immediately puts you like, if we're not all at like an equal playing field, like holding hands in a circle, like that's the visual I need for like any sort of community or group. I need us all to be like equals. The second it starts to form a pyramid, which kind of is funny because it kind of connects back to what we were talking about before, I start my alarms start going off and I'm like, I don't like this. Like
Yeah.
any kind of power dynamic like that where yeah, someone is like, I have the way. Um,
Yeah. I think there's a lot of comfort for people. I think about this with I talk about like fundamentalism a little bit in my newest season, that there is a certain level of comfort for people. And I think that's kind of our answer to that is religion and like certain belief systems is like, there's a lot of comfort in thinking that you know all the answers. There's a
Mm.
lot of comfort in saying like, I know X, Y, and Z are true. And so I kind of build my life and my behaviors, my community groups. You kind of structure your entire social system, your understanding of the world around that belief system. And if you don't have a defined belief system, then you're really building that yourself. You're trying to figure it out. You're out in the world just putting shit together, you know? And I think that's where people find comfort in religion. And I did too. It's very comforting to say, I know all the answers, or at least I know
Mm.
some of the answers, and I
Mhm.
can build my world around that.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
comforting
100%.
until it's not, until you look around and you're like, "Wait a second."
Yeah, or things
Yeah.
really deeply align with you and they don't feel like they're truths, for yourself and your body. Do you have any advice for someone maybe navigating a space with where they're in a place of feeling like they're not the place that they are, whether it is in like a religious setting or in an organization where like this doesn't feel right, like something isn't right here, I'm not supposed to be here, but I feel like I can't get out in a certain sense. Do you have any advice for someone like that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I think connect both kind of religious organizations, MLMs, scams, groups like that, cults, is they sometimes can teach you not to trust your own intuition. They're just like, they'll tell you, oh, you're just feeling some doubt. You're just feeling some, fear, some excitement, and they kind of obfuscate your ability to listen to your own intuition. And so, what I would tell somebody most of the time when I tell people, especially who are in MLMs, is trust your gut. If something doesn't feel right, then listen to that and explore that and give yourself time and space away from the busyness of life. Because I think sometimes when you're in an MLM, when you're in some kind of community group that's they bogart your time, you're very consumed by that thing. To say if you're feeling some type of way, make sure that you're taking an hour to yourself to just sit and think and decide if that thing is really for you. And I think it's also true that somebody who's inside of one of these groups is only able to see that if they're willing to look at it. And that comes in its own time. Somebody who leaves an MLM, they've usually been thinking about leaving it for a couple of years or maybe a year at another company. And then they moved to another company because they thought that it would be a better option for them. And they still felt that same thing. So I'd say those things take time too, and to give yourself the grace and the space to just take your time. And it's okay if you don't see it right away. Like life is so long, like you have so much time to do what you need to do. So yeah, I think that would be my advice for them.
Yeah. We talk, I mean, the foundation of our work is like the intuition and helping our audience really tap into that part of themselves. And that's one thing we say all the time is like, your intuition's never going to go away. It'll always be there. It'll always be like a comforting, loving voice that will just, tap you on the shoulder every so often. And if you're not ready, it's okay. It's patient, it's kind. And when you are ready, it'll be there to set off the final alarm and kind of help you down the path. And that's the thing, your intuition won't go away in that moment. Like once you leave, your intuition will still be there to help guide you through the next chapter, whatever that'll look like. And I guess that's where like the scary part comes in. Like you said, it's when you are in an organization or a religion or a cult or MLM, whatever it may be, there's someone telling you the rule book. There's someone telling you how you're supposed to live your life. So once you leave, it's like, oh, now what do I follow? And it's yourself. And it is that intuition, it's that internal guidance system. So learning how to then tap into that is the whole next chapter of things.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's why we find it's so common for people to leave one kind of high control group and join another one or join some sort of group because they're looking for that same structure. They're looking for that same kind of leadership, somebody to follow, somebody to understand and kind of tell them what they're supposed to be thinking. I find that a lot. I'm definitely guilty of that too. I think it's a common human experience to be like, okay, I need to find something else, but like maybe something similar to what I was looking for before. Maybe I wasn't off track there. Um, but yeah, you just got to trust your gut.
Yeah.
Do you feel like you were always connected with your intuition, or do you think that came with time of feeling like you weren't in the right space?
I think I've always been very intuitive. I come from a long line of very spiritual and intuitive women. I think that's a gift that I have. I've always been kind of like, that doesn't feel right. That feels okay. I kind of have this internal compass, but I think a lot of that is learned too. There are definitely times in my life where I wasn't listening to it, when I was just like, these are the rules. This is what I'm supposed to be doing because this person told me that this is how I'm supposed to live my life. But I think for the most part, like I said, I'm a skeptic. I'm like naturally a pessimistic person. So when I meet somebody for the first time, I wish I was more like of a welcoming person, somebody who's like, I'm gonna just approach everybody with the same open-mindedness, but that's not me. I'm always like, I don't know about you yet. Let me just see. A lot of the times I'm right, but I try not to like cast judgment before I like really get to know somebody.
Well, I thought you were extremely welcoming when we met you. And honestly, I can relate to that where there's moments when you're watching everyone else react to someone and you're like, no, like I don't feel that. No. And there's plenty of times when I talk myself out of it where I'm like, you should have been nicer. Look at the way everyone looks at them. You're wrong. You're just in a bad mood, whatever it may be. And then give it 6 months and something happens. And I'm like, I fucking knew it.
Mhm.
I knew it.
Yeah.
And I should have trusted my gut
Yeah.
from like from the first moment. But you're watching everyone else, you're internalizing all of that. So I think honestly, it's a superpower. I don't think it's a negative at all. And I've been fascinated recently looking at people and thinking of like, especially women and ancestors and how, so like you said, you come from a line of highly like intuitive or spiritual women. And I just think like they're all probably looking at you now that they're disconnected from any kind of organization or space like that, if they're around, probably so proud of you and probably like in awe of the work that you're doing because you're like at the forefront of exposing a lot of control and manipulation and honestly like negative energy that I think is really beautiful. So good job. I like it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's very nice of you.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. And if anyone wants to consume any of your content or listen to your podcast, watch your TikToks, how can they do so?
Yeah, so you can find my podcast anywhere you listen to podcasts, Spotify, Apple. It's called Opportunity Cost. And then on social, I'm on Instagram and TikTok at OppCostPod, OppCostPod.
All right. And I'll link that in the show notes. Well, thank you so much for talking to us today.